Yes, you did read that correctly. Modern day Americans are infected. For a nation so proud of individualism, we sure don't act like it. I'd like to kick this episode off with a little experiment. So I'm going to display a screen with several images on it and then follow it up with a question. Do you think how you reacted when you saw all of these pictures was due to the person or event? And another question to consider is, would someone, say, in a village in Africa have had the same reaction when they had little to no exposure to American culture and society? I'd argue no, they wouldn't. Maybe on some of the things that have been more world impacting, but our reactions and emotional responses to all of these images are a direct result of social contagions. Today, we will be discussing social contagions and how they have such a large impact on Americans, and honestly always have. A social contagion is a subtle and sometimes unwitting spread of emotions or behaviors from one individual to others. So, what are some examples? We see this in our day-to-day life. Little things like speeding when others are, or new diets, exercise, fads, clothing trends, even gifts and memes. If we wanted to simplify this a lot, it is the sense of, well, everyone else is doing it, or a more recent acronym, FOMO, fear of missing out. Obviously, adolescents are going to be more likely to be influenced, but that does not mean that adults are exempt. I know we can all think of one very recent trend that has impacted adults far more than adolescents, the Ozempic trend. When I hear the word contagion, it makes me think of post-apocalyptic movies or shows, often involving, the undead or the end of the world as we know it. At its core, a social contagion is not good or bad. It entirely depends on the context and the intent. As I mentioned, a lot of the social contagions that we are infected by, we don't even realize that we are. Like, again, speeding when someone else is. It's not like we're like, oh, yeah, because that person is speeding, I'm going to speed as well. That's not a conscious thought that goes through our head. It's just an automated response. Social contagions are very closely linked to herd mentality, which describes the phenomenon where individuals adopt behaviors or opinions based on the actions of the majority around them, essentially spreading like a contagion through a group, often without critical thinking. I feel like that's just a theme in all of my research to date for this channel. Americans don't want to think for themselves anymore. It's much more easy and convenient to just go based off of someone else. And the most common people who spread these social contagions are generally very magnetic people, and they just can't help but draw people in. Or it's an authority figure who you feel like you can't help but emulate or think how they think or behave how they're behaving. And if you do, there's some type of consequence that will come from it. That's actually one thing that also came up in my research on social contagions. Cognitive dissonance is a theory that suggests that individuals experience discomfort or dissonance when their beliefs or actions are inconsistent with those of the group. To reduce the dissonance, individuals may conform to the behavior of the group. But again, I emphasize there are positive social contagions. I found an example from one of my favorite movies that I always forget about, Forrest Gump.
Are you doing this for world peace?
Are you doing this for the homeless?
Are you running for women's rights?
Or for the environment? Or for animals?
They just couldn't believe that somebody would do all that running for no particular reason.
Why are you doing this?
I just felt like running.
And a lot of the time, there isn't a good reason why a particular person starts doing something or feels a certain way or reacts a certain way. But if they have the magnetic personality or a big following, everyone else is going to want to join in.
I just felt like running.
That's you. I can't believe it's really you.
For some reason, when I was doing, it seemed to make sense to me.
I mean, it was like an alarm went off in my head, you know? I said, here's a guy that's got his act together. Here's somebody who's got it all figured out. Here's somebody who has the answer. I'll follow you anywhere, Mr. Gump.
So I got company. And after that, I got more company. Then even more people joined in. Somebody later told me it gave people hope. Nah.
Other people interpret the things that we do and others do as something in their mind. The actions of others will always be interpreted differently depending on the person it is. For instance, the guy that ran up to him and said he would follow him anywhere because he seemed like he had it all together, when really Force just wanted to run. And that's a good example of one positive social contagion. You see someone running or doing whatever it is, and you want to emulate that because it gives you hope, which, if we're being honest, we really do need a little bit more of in our country. So that's just one example of a positive result coming from a social contagion. Now, there are also negative results. Because as we all know, when large groups get together, the best things don't always result. We have had many examples of negative social contagions in the last 5 years even. So many protests have led to violence, burning and destroying buildings, and just generally very destructive behavior. And if it had been just one or two people, it likely would not have had the same results that it did. But one or two people ignited something in a large group of others, which led to things like this. All of this destruction started from Americans using their constitutional rights, the right to protest. However, I'm not sure where the peaceful got lost in the midst of it, but I'm fairly sure it's when you added more people to the protests. Anger and hatred are such strong emotions, and we all have both of them in us to some degree, but we need to recognize that when we spread that hatred and anger to others, whether it be online or in person, destruction will come from it. Maybe not to this magnitude, but both of those are rooted in negativity. There was another video I came across as well that also discussed the negative impacts of social contagions on our society. And it started out with discussing Robin Williams' suicide from several years ago.
There's a lot of research that suicide is contagious. This is why newspapers don't mention suicide when someone commits suicide. They don't say it. And the idea is here that when suicide is glamorized, even unintentionally, more people will do it. And that sounds so crazy. What do you mean more people will commit suicide? But it seems to be true. Do you remember when Robin Williams committed suicide? It's back in 2014. In the 4 months following his suicide, there was a 10% increase in the number of suicides compared to what would be expected. That's another 2,000 people ended their life. And they could say, okay, well, over the next 4 months, we would expect 17,000 people to commit suicide just based off of averages and what happened last year and the year before. They expect 17,000. And there were 19,000 people who committed suicide. 10% jump, 2,000 more people. And it wasn't even just the number of people. It was the means of suicide. There was a 35% increase in that one particular way that Robin Williams committed suicide. Interesting.
Maybe that 10% increase would have happened anyway. But that's hard for me to believe when, like he just mentioned, it was the same type of suicide as well. So even if there were 10% more people who were going to commit suicide, the fact that they did it the same as Robin Williams, who was, for the entire United States, a massively influential actor. He was hilarious. I loved the majority of his movies. So it goes back to being and doing the same as very magnetic people, people who we hold in high esteem. So you may be asking, what's the best way for me to figure out if I'm being infected by a social contagion or if it's just my own thoughts? And the best way to do that is to pause and ask yourself, why am I doing this? Why am I eating this? Why am I behaving like this? And if the answer is it came from an external influence, again, they're not always bad things, but you have to take the time and consider the action, if it's good or bad, not just if it's popular or trending or not, because that is a very poor indicator of good or bad. Think about, is this good for me? Is this good for my mind, for my body, for my life? I know we may not use it very often, but we do have minds of our own that are very capable of critical thought. And that just means to break down a situation, break down an action, break down an emotion or a behavior. Another way is to diversify your exposure. Instead of feeding into the algorithm, whether it be online or in your own life, of the same thing over and over again, diversify either with people or with the content that you're looking at. Or, heaven forbid, get offline, go outside, read a book, spend time with friends and family. That all leads to a good quality life. And both critical thinking and diversifying your exposure to certain things will help you know your own opinions and know your own thoughts. And it'll make you comfortable stating them. When you know your own thoughts, when you know your own mind, you'll be able to control your emotions and your actions. And though all social contagions are not negative, the ones that are can literally be life-altering. You saw the pictures of what can be done when a group of individuals are all infected by the same social contagion, the same behavior, the same thoughts. So just like with all contagions, do your best to only be infected by the ones that are going to build your immune system and not make you critically ill. The reality is, at the end of the day, there will always be social contagions, but we have control over our own thoughts, our own minds. We just need to use that control a little bit more. Thanks for joining. See you next week.